With their latest release, RaceFace insists they are entering a new era of... Nah, I don't know, it feels weird. Woo! That was violent.
Bro, these are my cranks.
Wait a second, those are off my bike, dude. What am I supposed to do?
Today, once again, we're going to be breaking things. I've got the entire line of RaceFace carbon cranks, and we're gonna crack them open and see what's inside these to be able to tell you whether this is something you should be spending your money on. I'm pretty impressed. This is like significant improvement. I swore off carbon cranks years ago after 50-50ing a small double and watching as the top of my crank arm flew away, smashing into my shin and leaving a gaping hole. After a couple instances like this, I decided it was no more for me and carbon cranks. The only ones I've kept onto over the years are RaceFace's 6C cranks, which live on my downhill bike. Even this model has been known to have its problems though. So, that begs the question, is it worth it to spend $450+ to save a few grams when you could spend $150 on a tried and true aluminum crank set? Well, with their new release, RaceFace insists that they are entering a new era of carbon crank design, claiming that their redesigned pedal inserts are bonded directly to the carbon layup, making Era the strongest, stiffest, and most durable carbon crank ever created by RaceFace. But what does that really mean? Well, I asked them, and they didn't really give me any further information than what is in this marketing spiel right here. So, to that effect, we've got our breaker bar here, we've reinforced our workbench, and we're gonna do some, well, braking. I'm gonna start with RaceFace's Next SL, their super light, cross-country oriented carbon crank here. So, Logan the other day finally affixed our vise to the bench, so now it's actually functional. We've got our nice Chester pedal here, so this will actually test the durability of Chester pedals too. We're gonna see if this breaks the crank or probably the pedal first.
Oh.
All I did was bend the spindle. Well, that bodes well for the crank, but let's pull this spindle out of there and get it closer so we can just focus on the crank arm itself. All right, so take two. We've got it just on the pedal spindle now. I'm also gonna stand a little further away because I was a little scared being that close. Let's do it again. There we go. We have failure. Well, that's one way to get the old insert out of there, I suppose. Sorry, RaceFace. I do feel bad about that. Okay, so that was our Next SL, the super light. This is a very light crank that's not designed to get smashed on, and I'm actually pretty impressed. This spindle, which was in the vise, did bend significantly despite being choked way up there in the vise. This is a steel spindle, and this started bending way before this started cracking, which I'm actually pretty impressed about. This type of failure is not something you would normally see. It's not something I've ever seen on one of these cranks. Normally this becomes unbound, like unglued almost from the inside of the carbon. So you get sort of this floating feeling on your pedal. And that's the failure we've seen in these before. But here we can see the actual insert they've used. Not a huge thing. It doesn't extend too much far past the actual threads themselves. So what I'm expecting and sort of hoping, anticipating, is that with the new Era, this piece will be significantly larger and we'll have a lot more carbon wrapped around it so that it doesn't become unbound, like I mentioned. Let's go through the whole line though and do the Next R and the 6C crank so we can get kind of a visual of what they might have done differently across the spectrum of their models. Next up, I've got the Next R crank. This is their sort of enduro crank that they released a few years ago and is intended to be a bit burlier than the SL. It does weigh a little bit more, but it's a fairly lightweight crank. So again, I've got it really choked up there because we were seeing the spindle bend. Makes a lot of sense. And I'm trying to kind of replicate sort of what happens when you like land on a really big impact or something like that. Not a perfect test, but that's okay. This is the Next R crank set. That was a bit more dramatic than the Next SL. That was sort of like a pretty catastrophic. I definitely had to like put more force in it, and you could tell that it kind of wanted to hold for longer. The other one started sort of crinkling a little more easily. Oh boy. And this actually didn't break at the insert, which means we're gonna have to do some cutting or something. This actually just broke the center of the crank itself. It didn't break the insert. Let's see if we can rip that insert out of there. Insert number 2. This is wild. So it actually broke the teeth off. That's pretty impressive. I'm assuming that's aluminum. I think these are aluminum actually. It broke the aluminum teeth off, which kind of goes to show how bound into the carbon they are. There, you can see them in there. There you can see that tooth and that guy right there. Like a pretty significant increase in how well, affixed those were. And yeah, that really did not want to come out. This is the Next SL crank, and that's that Next R. Next up, I've got the 6C crank. Now I will note that I've been impressed so far because the spindles have bent on both the SL and the Next R before the crank broke, which is, again, a steel piece. Pretty impressive that being clamped here, it's bending that before the carbon breaks. This crank, however, does have that floating insert, so I anticipate this one may crack a little prematurely, more so than those. This is the crank that I've been running on my downhill bike for years now, the same set, and they have held up really, really well. I've been really happy with this crank, and it has been one of the few that I've sort of trusted to run. But let's give this a go and see what it does. The RaceFace 6C downhill crank. All right, and like I predicted, because that one was already floating, it did break a little more easily. I'm seeing more of those aluminum teeth broken off. Oh, actually one fell out right here. It broke off, holy cow, it broke off quite a few of the teeth. Logan and I were looking, and there are some differences, particularly between that Next SL insert and the Next R insert that allows for a little more like carbon overlap and kind of tying around these teeth to keep that really affixed in there. I am excited because now we get to do the final era crank and see what they've done differently for this new era of carbon cranks.
You guys want to watch the last crank break?
Yeah.
All right, y'all, here we have it. The RaceFace era crank. It is a new era of carbon crank design. It has an aluminum plate instead of the cheap plastic covering to prevent crank rub and wear. And now we're gonna find out what this patent pending incredible new insert technology is that they won't tell us anything about. Let's do it.
So this is kind of the moment of truth to see what's going on.
This is it. This is the era. This is your.
Okay, sweet.
Wait a second, where'd you get these cranks?
Bro, these are my cranks.
Wait a second, those are off my bike, dude. What am I supposed to do?
Oh yeah, those ones are.
Those are off my
Dude,
bike.
Rich, it's science. This
Yeah.
it's for scientific purposes.
It's in the handbook.
All right, well, I guess I'll figure out cranks.
Final boss, RaceFace era carbon crank. Woo!
There she goes.
That was violent. That did not want to go.
You did it, you broke it. All right, folks, how should we break it next time?
Impressive.
There it is. It's
Wow.
definitely different. We might have to do some cutting to see what this new patent pending insert is, because it's different. There's definitely more going on. Like, you can tell it was the carbon that gave that time as opposed to like right at the insert itself. All this stayed bonded on there. And it was actually, I think, where the crank becomes hollow. That was the weak point. So they've turned that from the weak point into now it's up here, which is a good thing because I'm putting like an obscene amount of, you would never get this much force on your crank arm under any sort of normal circumstances. Like even Rampage riders aren't doing what I'm doing to their cranks. What this tells me is that they've essentially fixed the problem of these little guys coming loose because that was no longer the weak point in this new era crank. So they weren't lying to us. They just probably don't want other crank manufacturers to know what they're doing. Now we're gonna have to do some figuring to see how we can pull this out of here a little bit better.
Let's light it on fire.
What did everybody say? Dynamite.
Dynamite.
Shoot it with a gun.
Shoot it.
9 mil.
Back it over with the car.
I'm pretty impressed. This is like significant improvement over all the previous designs. I'm gonna try and get this insert out a little bit further, pull some of that carbon away so we can really see what's going on here. We can see a few differences already. Instead of being this circular piece with teeth, like in the previous models of crank, it now has this flat edge here that extends further out. And there's also these two aluminum bits that I assume are attached to that somehow. We're gonna see if we can pry that away. All right, so it's kind of becoming clear what they've done here. They've basically made the entire end, it's less of an insert and really like, this is really the whole end of the crank now. It just has kind of thin layer of carbon wrapped around the entirety of it. And it's a much larger, more structural piece than the little rings from the old cranks.
Okay, so next up, first off, shout out to Dave from Galbraith Gravity Racing for loaning me this respirator like a year ago. I need to get it back to him. I forgot I had it. Thank you, Dave. We're gonna cut this in half so we can get kind of a cross section, see what's going on here. So this is pretty interesting. It comes around like that. All right, that's cool. No wonder it's not ripping apart. But I'm gonna cut all three of these so we can compare the wall thicknesses of the various cranks.
I've now gone through and I've cut every crank arm in half, and I've done a cross section of the new insert on the Era cranks, and let's do a quick comparison of all these different options and see what they've done differently here. So this is pretty interesting. Here we have our Era crank arm. It broke here just above the insert on the arm itself, and then we've cut it down the center this way and this way. So let's take a look. A lot going on here. This is a wholly different beast, but you can see that there's this lip that comes up around here. This is the outside of the crank arm. So there's now carbon holding it around. I think it's probably pretty safe to assume that this continues around, encircles your threads, at least until around here or something. And they shove carbon in there now, which makes for a much stronger bond. And then they've also, this is kind of interesting, you can see it from this angle. This is that same channel there, so unlike that. And you can see how much carbon is now shoved in around the entire insert. So this thing is really just not gonna come loose, which is a vast improvement from the previous design, which was just this simple aluminum circle with these teeth jutting out from it. They made some changes there throughout the years. Like you can see here, this is the Next SL these were fairly wide, and this little divot is not that deep. On the next R, these teeth kind of protrude out so that carbon gets tucked in there more deeply. And yeah, the divot itself is deeper. So they did make some changes to improve that from, sort of debonding from the carbon. But it still happened from time to time, as was the case with this 6C insert that was this was a warranty one that had come loose. That's why it broke so easily. Next up, I want to look at the actual changes in crank arm design across the board. The 6C, we'll start with the 6C because it's the oldest model, and you can see that it had this sort of angled edge here at the top, which in the later designs they went away from. These all become much boxier. So on this top edge, it's 2.9 millimeters thick and 2.9 millimeters thick, top and bottom, versus gets a little thicker on the edges. 4.2, just under 4.3, 4.3. Then again, you can see here on the next R, the top gets thinner. It looks like the sides get quite a bit thicker. Let's take a look. And it gets this box shape instead of this angle up here. So that's quite a bit thinner. That's 2 millimeters thick. I think we said this was 2.9 on the 6C. And on the inside is 3.2 versus the edges are now 4.5. They kind of like shifted around where the carbon was. I bet they kind of figured out where failure was happening and where they needed to really beef that up. And let's take a look at the lightest crank in their lineup. This is the Next SL. 2.7, this one was 2, 2.5. So that's interesting. 3.2, they kind of changed how they went about this here. The top side is actually a bit thicker than the bottom, which is flipped from the Next R. Let's look at the 3.75 versus 4.4. So you start to get an idea of where they're saving weight on this Next SL. And lastly, let's take a look at the newest model. I'll compare it to the Next R because that's kind of its sort of most direct competitor, I would say. Pretty similar on all the edges. Maybe the sides are a bit thicker. 2.6 on the top, 2.6 millimeters thick on the inside, 3.3 on the edges. The Next R was 4. I think that's okay though, because really the issue that these carbon cranks had was not breaking, on the crank arm itself. That rarely happened. It's not typically gonna break where I've cut it here. The issues tended to arise at the insert itself, and as we can see here, they've really done a whole lot of work on designing a new insert that's gonna stand up to a lot more abuse. And the way that we were breaking these today was exerting so much force on there. I'm not gonna take the time to figure out the math on how much force I was putting on these cranks, but it's way more than you would ever experience while riding your bike. You can see how much they actually bend and flex before braking, which I was really astonished by. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I had sworn off carbon cranks and have stuck with my E-wings for the last number of builds. They've just traveled with me from bike to bike. But realistically, a $1,000 titanium crankset is not something that most of us are ever gonna even think about purchasing. I think even $450+ like these carbon cranks is pushing it for most of us. So if you have budget to splurge on your bike and you really want to lighten things up, can we say that the new era would be a good way to do that? I think so. I think I'm gonna have to change my tune a little bit, because the issues that we've seen in the past with RaceFace cranks and other carbon cranks out there has often come about at these inserts. And now that we've done these cross sections on the new era insert, I personally am convinced that this is gonna be a much more solid solution and something that's gonna really last a long time. The issues always came about here, and you weren't seeing crank arms break like the absurd test I did with my breaker bar. That's just not a real world scenario. And I think if you have a bit of money to spend and wanna really lighten up your bike, a crank is a good way to do that. You can save a lot of weight here for a couple $100. So we'll leave that choice up to you. And in the meantime, I think it's safe to say RaceFace has entered a new era of carbon cranks with these. Our new crank arms broke. Let me see if we can get them warranted. Hey guys. So Sam, RaceFace has these new era cranks, and they have a no BS warranty policy.
Okay.
So even if you crash or something and break them, they say they'll send you a new set. And I kind of wanted to see if they would send us a new warranty set so that I could get Rich his cranks back.
Okay. Yeah, I'll see what they say. Something warranty, like, it's just riding along. Science.
Yeah.